Oliver James uncovers the truth about the science of genetics, that our genes actually play little part in shaping who we are. Today, in our Tingledom book club, we'll be looking at Not in Your Genes by Oliver James, the real reason children are like their parents. But first, let me light up our candles. And one you can't see, but we can still see the light of. I just finished reading this book, probably in the last week or so. It's quite an interesting book. Oliver James talks through, we look in the contents. You can see one of the chapters is Why Was Peaches Geldof So Like Her Mother? And I'm pretty sure he's British. And so I think Peaches Geldof is perhaps a British celebrity. I've never heard of her. But apparently both her and her mother died in very similar ways. And so he uses that as a case study for basically how traits are passed on through nurture rather than nature. And the real causes of ability, I think that one, he traces Tiger Woods quite a bit, and the environment that Tiger Woods was raised in, where neither of his parents were very good at golf, but they created this high premium on being a good golfer, and he would suffer maltreatment when he didn't do well, essentially, and that's part of the reason why he became very good. So the book, that is the, it's in the title. The idea of the book is basically that, I think his idea is that pretty much nothing is determined in our genes as far as our personality. He does, in some points, actually talk about attractiveness and those sort of traits which would be more genetic, and that there is more favorable treatment given to more attractive children or people, etc., etc. So by implication, there would be impacts of that sort of genetics on personality. But it's very obvious that he very strongly believes that we are primarily created by nurture. One of his arguments for the genetic side of that is the Human Genome Project, and that a lot of geneticists believe that they would isolate particular genes for personality traits, and that hasn't been the case. They haven't been able to find any real single genes that correspond to traits or mental illness and the like. And so he goes in to discuss what a lot of geneticists are thinking at present, is that it's a combination of factors, and that there would be multiple genes involved, and that there is probably an environmental component as well. And so basically you might be primed to a particular sort of mental illness or particular personality, and then if you are in that environment, then that will arise. If you're not in that environment, then it won't. So while I was reading the book and this is the way I approach most things when I'm reading them. I tend not to try to be too critical as I'm reading. I want to see what are people saying, let them kind of sell me on it, and it's more in reflection that I'll really delve deep and see, okay, well, do I think that lines up? How does that all sit once I've actually seen the whole thing? Because obviously with different writing styles or different perceptions or ideas on how writing might be, and I have also done a bit of proofreading, so you can get down to nitty-gritties, and if you're always looking for an overly critical eye, there's a lot to be critical of. And when I'm reading for enjoyment, I try not to be too critical. So, that being said, so as I was going along, I thought it was fairly compelling reading. I thought it was very interesting, and it definitely has swayed my thoughts on how big a component nurture is for our personality. I do think it's a much larger part than I did before I read this book. That being said, I don't necessarily agree with him that pretty much everything is determined by nurture. He talks a lot about that the genetic basis for personality is often based on twin and adoption studies. And he tries to discredit basically all twin studies based on particular details in maybe one twin study, which I didn't find the most compelling. And my general sense, I guess from my experience with people who I've known who have been adopted, is that, well, for example, one of my cousins was adopted, and he's the only person in that side of the family who has gone to jail. And I think he was adopted as a baby, so it wouldn't be that he was, maltreated and then adopted at 3 years old or that sort of thing that would have led to that. And his personality is quite different from anyone else on that side of the family who is genetically related to me. And that's anecdotal, obviously, and I've done a little bit more reading, though, on adoption. And that it seems like the general consensus is that often personality will tend to be more determined by, the traits will be more similar with the biological parents than necessarily with the adopted parents. So that, I think, is something that pokes a hole, and I think part of the problem with the way that he's presented his argument, and that he's actually made it quite black and white. He's presented it that pretty much everything is all nurture, and there's no genetic component. So it's a really hard sell to actually buy that completely. That being said, lots of interesting things I want to say. So he suggests that why traits run in families is because of not a genetic component, but the nurture component, because obviously that nurture would get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And I do think that's a compelling argument. I do think that a lot of personality traits and knowledge and that sort of thing are learned from your parents, are learned, but I I just can't buy that it's 100% or, 95%. I think, as I said, I think it's much higher than I thought it was initially. And it is compelling in that way, but I just don't buy that it's 100%. So, the chapter on your role in the family drama, why siblings are so different. We actually have two there, but the theory there is actually quite compelling to me and very interesting. So, one of the things that he talks about is the birth order. So, what he essentially says is that the first child is often quite obedient, much more like the parents than subsequent children. The first child basically learns to get attention from the parents by being like them, by excelling, by being a leader, all these sort of things. And he says then subsequent children, if they do the exact same thing as the older child, there's nothing to differentiate them. And what's interesting about that is that actually fits quite nicely into ecological theory as well, which is niche partitioning. So basically, it would essentially be that the oldest child is filling a particular niche, and then the second child, when they come, will fill another niche. So siblings may end up being quite different from each other because they are trying to differentiate themselves. And they're not going to get as much attention for just being exactly like their older sibling. And this is also suggestive of why younger siblings tend to be more likely to be rebellious and to rebel. Which, for me, I'm a second child, and my sister is definitely much more adherent to rules. She's definitely much more more obedient and that sort of thing, and I tend to be a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more on my own, do my own thing, and so that is consistent with my own experience. So I definitely think that birth order does have this impact, and that there would be this kind of niche partitioning happening among children, particularly as you get more and more children, they're going to have to do something else to seem different from each other. That being said, he does also make the point that children within a family will still often share personality traits in common with each other as well, because we all know that we learn to socialize, we develop our own ways of relating to each other within the family, and that will impact our personalities. But one of the biggest sources of differentiation and causes of differences in personality, as mentioned by Oliver James in this book, is to do with childhood maltreatment. I don't have this page anymore, so we'll go back to the cover. So, childhood maltreatment, I haven't read more about it since reading this book, but one of the points that he talks about is that there is actually a very common thread quite often with the form of maltreatment that children receive and mental illnesses that they may develop later in life. And I believe it was that there's a strong correlation between sexual abuse and schizophrenia, whereas other types of emotional or physical abuse may be more associated with other types of mental illness. And neglect can cause its own sort of mental illness as well. And to me, that is a compelling sort of figure. Obviously, if you think about not just children, but you think about the way that soldiers or people who are put into very high stress situations, there can often be similar responses across the board because it's just a human way to react to those particular stimulus that's very negative. And so I do find that compelling. All in all, I would say for this book, I would say it's definitely worth reading. It's very interesting, the stories that he takes you through. I found the analysis of Tiger Woods' life very, very interesting, very fascinating to delve more into that. But I would say also to, I guess, always, and this is what I think with any book, is to keep a questioning mind. Because I think I want to come to your own conclusion, I guess, about how valid you think his arguments are. Because there definitely, I was reading, and there definitely are geneticists who are trying to point out flaws in his reasoning. I'm not really qualified to do that, so I won't really touch on that. Only to say that there is not consensus in his direction, I would say. But I wouldn't say there's necessarily consensus at all. It's generally thought that it probably is a mixture of nature and nurture. What was interesting is he talked about in the book that, so he has some psychotherapy training, and his parents were both psychotherapists. And so it was a big topic of discussion around their dinner table, nature versus nurture. So looking into the psychology of his motivation for writing this book, I could see that he may have had one or another of his parents who may agree with him or disagree with him, and he may have found it beneficial to look into this book for that reason. But anyway, that was just an aside. It is very interesting, though. I definitely do think it's worth a read. It really will open your mind about different concepts and can help you evaluate perhaps where certain personality traits that you have come from. So that's our first one. I'm just going to now show you what we'll be looking at next time. So our next book will be The Examined Life by Stephen Gross. I loved this book, so I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. A lot of insight, so I hope to see you